That envelope was switched. A small voice cut through the polished silence of the Manhattan boardroom like a blade through glass, and every conversation stopped mid-breath as heads turned toward the source, where an 8-year-old black girl stood near the edge of a long mahogany table under the cold glow of crystal chandeliers. Jonathan Pierce, a billionaire known for closing billion-dollar deals without raising his voice, slowly lowered the pen he had been about to sign with, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the girl standing there as if she had stepped out of place and time itself. "Aaliyah," his assistant Daniel Brooks whispered sharply, stepping forward. "You need to wait outside." But the girl did not move, her small hands clenched, her gaze locked on the sealed white envelope sitting beside the contract folder like it carried a secret too heavy for the room to ignore. Across the table, Victoria Hale offered a soft, controlled smile, the kind that never reached her eyes, adjusting her designer gloves as she tilted her head slightly. "Jonathan, I think your staff is letting emotions interfere with business," she said gently, though her tone carried a precise edge meant to dismiss what could not yet be proven. But Aaliyah Carter took one step forward, then another, her shoes barely making a sound on the marble floor, and pointed directly at the envelope. "I saw him switch it," she said clearly, her voice small but steady, and in that instant the room seemed to shrink around her words. A low murmur spread through the executives seated along the table, some exchanging confused glances, others hiding faint smiles as if entertained by a child's imagination. But Jonathan did not smile, his attention sharpening as he studied her face, noticing something he had learned to recognize in business negotiations that cost millions: certainty. "Switch what exactly?" he asked slowly, his tone controlled, not dismissive but not yet convinced, and Aaliyah turned her head slightly toward Daniel Brooks, whose expression had gone rigid, his hand hovering near the tablet on the table like he wanted to shut something down before it could be seen. "He took the real envelope," Aaliyah said, her voice tightening, "and replaced it with that one before the meeting started." And suddenly the air in the room felt heavier, as if the temperature had dropped a few degrees without warning. Victoria gave a soft laugh, almost elegant, almost rehearsed. "This is absurd," she said. "We are in a billion-dollar acquisition discussion, not a playground." But Jonathan raised a hand slightly, stopping the conversation before it could drift back into comfort, his eyes still fixed on Aaliyah. Outside the glass walls of the conference room, Manhattan stretched endlessly under pale daylight, taxis moving like distant thoughts. But inside, every sound seemed amplified, every breath measured, every glance weighted with something unspoken. Aaliyah reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded paper, placing it carefully on the table as if it were fragile evidence rather than a child's attempt to be believed. "I saw the logo on the first envelope," she said. "It had a silver seal, not gold." And for the first time Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Victoria before quickly dropping back down. Jonathan leaned slightly forward now, his posture changing in a way those who knew him recognized immediately, the posture of a man who had begun to calculate risk rather than dismiss it. "Why were you near the documents?" he asked, not accusing but searching, and Aaliyah hesitated just briefly before answering. "I was waiting outside the room, and the door was open. I saw everything." A silence followed, not empty but dense, as if the room itself was holding its breath, and Victoria finally straightened, her smile thinning. "Jonathan, I hope you are not considering entertaining this," she said softly. But there was a flicker now, just a flicker, of something less controlled beneath her words. Jonathan did not respond immediately, his gaze moving from Aaliyah to the envelope, then to Daniel, then back again as if assembling pieces of a puzzle that refused to align neatly, and Aaliyah's voice lowered slightly, but did not break. "If you open it now, you'll see it's not the same," she said. The room felt frozen in that moment, every executive watching, waiting for the billionaire's decision, while the envelope sat untouched like a sealed promise that might already be broken from within. Jonathan reached forward slowly, not yet opening it, but just placing his hand near it, and that simple movement alone shifted the entire atmosphere, because no one in the room had expected him to hesitate, and even fewer had expected him to listen to a child standing at the edge of a billion-dollar deal. And as his fingers hovered above the sealed paper, Aaliyah's eyes never left his face. as if she already knew the truth was no longer something that could stay hidden for much longer. The room remained suspended in an uncomfortable stillness as Jonathan Pierce kept his hand hovering just above the sealed envelope, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to read something invisible beneath the surface of the paper itself. Aaliyah Carter did not move, did not blink, only watched him with a quiet intensity that felt too heavy for someone so young, while the executives around the table shifted in their seats, unsure whether they were witnessing confusion, interruption, or something more serious beginning to unfold. Daniel Brooks forced a small laugh that sounded tight and unnatural, stepping closer to Jonathan. "Sir, we are on a very strict schedule. The acquisition team from Boston is already waiting on the call," he said carefully, but Jonathan did not look at him, his focus still locked on the envelope. Victoria Hale gently placed her hands together, her posture perfect, her voice calm and reassuring as she leaned slightly forward. "Jonathan, with all respect, I think this situation is being inflated by imagination," she said, her tone smooth like polished glass. "Children can misinterpret small details in highly sensitive environments," she added, glancing briefly at Aaliyah as if framing her presence as an inconvenience rather than a warning. Aaliyah's voice, however, cut through the polished calm of the room, small but steady. "I did not misinterpret anything," she said, her eyes shifting from Victoria back to Jonathan. "I saw the gold seal on the first envelope, and that one has a silver seal," she continued, pointing again with precision that made the room fall slightly quieter. Jonathan finally leaned back a fraction, his fingers withdrawing from the envelope, not in dismissal but in reconsideration, and he turned his gaze slowly toward Daniel Brooks. "Where did this envelope come from?" he asked, his tone even but no longer casual, and Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before responding. "It came from legal, standard delivery before the meeting," he said, but his eyes flicked away as soon as the words left his mouth. Aaliyah stepped forward another small step, now standing closer to the edge of the table. "That is not the one I saw," she repeated, more firmly now, and the weight of her certainty began to shift something subtle in Jonathan's expression, something like the beginning of doubt forming where there had only been procedure moments before. Victoria exhaled softly, almost amused. "Jonathan, if we begin rechecking every document based on a child's observation, we will never complete any transaction in this city," she said lightly. But Jonathan finally looked at her directly, and that look alone caused her smile to tighten slightly at the edges. "I am not dismissing anything yet," Jonathan said quietly, and the room changed again, because that was not a statement of agreement, but of escalation. He turned toward Daniel. "Bring up the security feed from this morning," he instructed, and Daniel froze for a fraction of a second before quickly recovering. "Sir, the feed from this floor is archived and requires IT approval," he said, but Jonathan's expression hardened just slightly, and Daniel nodded quickly. "I will retrieve it," he corrected himself, stepping back toward the corner terminal. Aaliyah's shoulders relaxed only slightly, but her eyes never left the envelope, as if she was still hearing something the others could not. Victoria adjusted her stance, her confidence still intact on the surface, but her fingers now tapping lightly against the table in a rhythm she did not seem aware of, while the executives exchanged glances that carried the quiet tension of people realizing a meeting had shifted from routine to uncertain. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the faint clicking of Daniel's keyboard as he accessed security records, the large screen on the wall flickering before displaying the corridor outside the boardroom earlier that morning. Jonathan stepped closer to the screen, arms now folded, while Aaliyah remained still behind him, and Victoria's gaze sharpened slightly as the footage began to play. The hallway appeared in grayscale surveillance clarity, empty at first, until Daniel Brooks himself appeared in frame carrying a sealed document folder, glancing both directions before stepping near the conference room door. A small shift occurred in the room as multiple people leaned forward slightly, and Aaliyah quietly whispered, "That is where it happened," without emotion but with certainty. The footage showed Daniel pausing briefly at the door, then a second figure approaching from the opposite side carrying another envelope, and a subtle exchange occurred, quick and efficient, too fast for casual notice, but clear enough when slowed. Jonathan raised one hand. "Pause it," he said, and the room froze on the exact moment of exchange. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, more defined, as if the air itself had recognized a change in direction. Daniel's face went still, Victoria's expression remained composed but unmoving, and Jonathan stared at the screen for a long moment without speaking. Aaliyah finally lowered her gaze slightly, not in triumph, but in quiet confirmation, as Jonathan slowly turned his head toward the table where the envelope still rested untouched, and for the first time, no one in the room spoke at all. The moment the paused surveillance frame froze on the screen, showing the exact exchange in the hallway, the atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted again, no longer uncertain, but quietly tense in a way that no one could ignore. Jonathan Pierce stood still for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the image as if repetition might somehow change what he had already seen, while Daniel Brooks remained near the control station, his hands hovering above the keyboard but no longer moving. Victoria Hale adjusted her posture once more, but the confidence she had carried earlier now felt slightly restrained, as if she was measuring every breath before it left her. Aaliyah Carter remained where she was, small in comparison to the long table and the adults surrounding it, yet somehow the most grounded presence in the entire room, her gaze still steady, her expression unchanged. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice calm but lower than before. "Play it again," he said, and Daniel obeyed immediately, rewinding the footage. The hallway replayed in slow motion, clearer this time, the exchange between Daniel and another staff member becoming impossible to misinterpret. Jonathan raised one hand slightly, stopping the playback once more, and turned his attention fully to Daniel. "Explain," he said simply, without anger, but with a kind of controlled precision that made the room feel smaller. Daniel swallowed, glancing briefly toward Victoria before responding. "It was a document exchange request from legal compliance," he said, but his voice lacked the firmness it had earlier. Aaliyah stepped closer to the table again, pointing softly. "That is not the same envelope I saw in this room," she repeated, her tone steady but not loud, as if stating a fact that did not require permission to exist. Jonathan turned his head slightly toward her, studying her carefully now, not as an interruption, but as a variable he could no longer ignore. "When exactly did you see the switch?" he asked, and Aaliyah thought for a moment before answering. "Before the meeting started, when the room was still empty, I was outside the door and I saw him bring in one envelope, then leave with another," she said, her words precise and unshaken. Victoria finally spoke again, her tone carefully softened. "Jonathan, even if there was a procedural inconsistency, this does not automatically mean wrongdoing," she said. "We are dealing with high-level corporate documentation," she continued, but Jonathan did not look at her immediately. Instead, he turned toward Daniel again. "Where is the original envelope now?" he asked, and this time Daniel hesitated longer, his eyes shifting toward the lower drawer of the conference desk before responding. "It was placed in temporary storage pending review," he said. A brief silence followed, and then Jonathan extended his hand. "Retrieve it," he said, and Daniel nodded quickly, moving toward the storage cabinet built into the side of the room. The executives seated along the table now sat completely still, their earlier casual posture replaced with quiet attention, as if everyone had finally realized that the meeting had shifted into something irreversible. Aaliyah remained standing, her small hands now resting lightly at her sides, but her gaze followed every movement in the room with quiet focus. Moments later, Daniel returned holding a second envelope, slightly different in texture and seal, and placed it beside the first one already on the table. Jonathan stepped forward, comparing them without speaking, his eyes moving between the two objects with increasing clarity. Victoria's expression tightened subtly, though she still maintained composure, while Daniel stood back, his posture no longer confident. Jonathan finally reached out and picked up both envelopes, turning them slowly in his hands, then looked toward Aaliyah. "Which one did you see first?" he asked, and she pointed without hesitation to the one with the gold seal. Jonathan nodded once, then turned toward the security screen again. "Zoom in on the exchange point," he instructed. The footage was enlarged, and for the first time a small detail became visible, a faint marking on the envelope Daniel had initially presented that did not match the official seal used in corporate legal transfers. A subtle shift passed through the room as multiple executives leaned in slightly, recognizing the implication without needing it explained. Victoria finally stepped forward, her voice controlled but noticeably firmer. "Jonathan, I want to remind you that all documentation passed through compliance verification before reaching this stage," she said. But Jonathan held up one hand again, not dismissing her, but pausing her. He looked down at the envelopes once more, then back at the screen, then finally at Aaliyah. "You were right," he said quietly, and the room seemed to exhale without sound. Aaliyah did not smile, did not react dramatically. She simply lowered her gaze slightly, as if confirming something she already knew would eventually be seen. Jonathan turned slowly toward Daniel. "Step outside the room," he said calmly, and Daniel obeyed immediately without argument, leaving the boardroom through the glass doors that closed behind him with a soft mechanical sound. The silence that followed was different again, no longer tense with confusion, but charged with realization. Victoria remained standing, her composure still intact but no longer unchallenged, as Jonathan placed both envelopes on the table side by side and looked at them for a long moment. Aaliyah finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. "The real one has the gold seal," she said simply, and in that moment, the truth no longer needed confirmation because it had already been seen. The boardroom remained silent for a long moment after the confirmation, as Jonathan Pierce stood between the two envelopes placed side by side on the polished mahogany table, his expression unreadable but deeply focused, as if every assumption he had carried into the meeting was now being reconstructed in real time. Aaliyah Carter stayed in the same position near the edge of the table, her small frame still and steady, while the executives around the room remained frozen in a state of quiet uncertainty, unsure whether the situation had already ended or was only beginning to unfold in a different direction. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "Bring everyone back in," he said, and one of the assistants quickly moved toward the door to call Daniel Brooks back into the room. Victoria Hale shifted slightly at the table, her expression composed but now visibly more controlled, as if recalibrating her presence in response to the shift in authority that had just occurred. Aaliyah looked up briefly at Jonathan, then back at the envelopes, her role in the moment already completed in her mind, though the consequences of it were still developing around her. When Daniel re-entered the room, he avoided eye contact, standing near the edge of the table as Jonathan gestured toward the envelopes. "Explain again," he said, and this time his tone carried a different weight, not anger, but expectation. Daniel cleared his throat, attempting to maintain composure. "There was a last-minute substitution request from internal review," he repeated, but his voice lacked consistency, and several executives exchanged glances that suggested they no longer accepted the explanation at face value. Jonathan slowly leaned forward, placing both hands on the table, his eyes moving from Daniel to Victoria, then briefly to Aaliyah. "Internal review does not authorize physical exchange of sealed legal documents without recorded chain of custody," he said, and the clarity in his statement caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Victoria responded quickly, her tone still smooth but now more deliberate. "Jonathan, if there was a procedural error, it is something we can correct internally without escalating uncertainty in front of the entire board," she said, but Jonathan did not immediately answer her. Instead, he turned toward Daniel again. "Who authorized the exchange?" he asked, and the silence that followed was longer this time, stretching across the room like a pause that no one wanted to fill. Daniel finally answered. "It was approved verbally by compliance oversight," he said, but Jonathan immediately raised a hand, stopping him. "Verbal authorization is not valid for this level of documentation," he replied. Aaliyah shifted slightly closer to the table, her voice quiet but steady. "That is not what I saw," she said again, and though she did not raise her tone, the certainty in her words caused several people to glance toward her. Jonathan looked at her for a longer moment now, as if considering not just what she said, but how consistently she had said it since the beginning. Victoria stepped forward slightly, attempting to redirect attention. "Jonathan, we are allowing this situation to distract from the actual purpose of this meeting, which is a strategic acquisition decision valued at over 200 million United States dollars, she said, emphasizing the scale of the transaction. but Jonathan remained focused on the documents in front of him. He slowly picked up the gold-sealed envelope. Again, turning it in his hands, then placed it down next to the silver-sealed one, aligning them carefully, as if comparison itself would reveal something further. The room was now completely attentive, no one speaking, no one interrupting, as Jonathan pressed a button on the conference table, activating a secondary internal audit feed that displayed metadata for document handling history. Lines of time-stamped records appeared on the screen, showing access points, user identifications, and transfer logs. Aaliyah watched quietly, her attention fixed not on the screen itself, but on the reactions of the adults in the room as the data loaded. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, his hands now clasped in front of him, while Victoria's gaze remained steady but less relaxed than before. Jonathan studied the screen carefully, then spoke without looking away. There is a discrepancy of exactly 4 minutes between recorded dispatch and logged receipt, he said, and the precision of his observation made the room feel even more controlled. Aaliyah spoke again softly. That is when it changed, she said, and Jonathan turned his head slightly toward her, acknowledging her statement without interrupting the flow of analysis. Victoria finally addressed Jonathan directly, her tone carefully measured. Even if there was a delay in logging, that does not imply intentional manipulation, she said, but Jonathan raised his eyes to her this time, holding her gaze longer than before. We are not discussing implication, he said calmly. We are reviewing recorded sequence, and the distinction in his wording shifted the tone of the entire exchange. The executives remained silent, watching as Jonathan returned his attention to the screen, where the transfer path now clearly showed an interruption point between 2 handlers. Aaliyah remained still, her presence no longer questioned, but quietly central to the unfolding clarity in the room. Jonathan finally exhaled slowly, then looked at both envelopes once more, placing a hand on the correct one with the gold seal. This is the original, he said, and for the first time since the meeting began, no one in the room offered disagreement. The moment Jonathan Pierce confirmed the gold-sealed envelope as the original, the atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted into something far more serious than confusion, as if every person present suddenly understood that the situation was no longer about a simple documentation error, but about control, responsibility, and consequences that extended beyond the walls of the room. Aaliyah Carter remained standing in the same position, her small hands relaxed now at her sides, her role in identifying the discrepancy completed, but her attention still quietly observing the reactions unfolding around her. Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the table, no longer attempting to explain, his earlier confidence replaced by a controlled stillness that suggested he understood the direction the conversation had taken. Victoria Hale, however, maintained her composure with deliberate precision, though the subtle tension in her posture suggested that she was no longer guiding the situation but responding to it. Jonathan slowly placed both envelopes down, aligning them one last time before speaking. This document will not be signed today, he said calmly, and the words carried immediate weight across the room, causing several executives to exchange brief glances. One of the senior board members leaned slightly forward. Jonathan, this postponement will affect the entire acquisition timeline by at least 72 hours, he said cautiously, but Jonathan raised his hand slightly, signaling that the decision had already been made. A delay is necessary when document integrity is uncertain, he replied, his tone steady and final. Victoria stepped forward just slightly, her voice measured but increasingly firm. Jonathan, this level of scrutiny over a minor procedural inconsistency could send the wrong message to our partners, she said, carefully choosing each word. But Jonathan finally turned to face her fully. This is not minor, he said simply, and the clarity in his response immediately quieted the room again. Aaliyah glanced up at Jonathan briefly, then back at the table, her expression unchanged, as if the outcome had always been inevitable once the truth was visible. Jonathan then pressed a button on the table, signaling his assistant outside the room, and within moments the glass doors opened again, allowing a quiet staff member to enter. Secure both envelopes and send them for full audit verification, Jonathan instructed, and the assistant carefully collected the documents without hesitation. Daniel's eyes followed the movement, but he remained silent, while Victoria's gaze narrowed slightly, though she did not interrupt. Jonathan turned slightly toward the executive team. Until verification is complete, all related transactions are suspended, he stated, and the impact of that decision settled across the room in visible silence. One of the executives spoke softly. This will require notification to the external partners immediately, and Jonathan nodded once. They will be informed of a temporary review hold, he replied. Aaliyah remained still, watching as the formal structure of authority adjusted itself around the corrected information, the environment shifting from assumption to verification in real time. Jonathan then looked at her again, this time with a different expression, less analytical and more reflective. You did not just notice a detail, he said quietly. You prevented an incorrect execution of a binding agreement. And the room became even quieter after that statement. Aaliyah did not respond verbally, only lowered her gaze slightly, as if she did not consider her action extraordinary, only necessary. Victoria finally spoke again, her tone softer now, but still controlled. Jonathan, I hope you understand that internal systems are being reviewed to prevent anything like this from happening again, she said, carefully re-establishing professional tone, and Jonathan gave a slight nod without breaking eye contact for long. That is expected, he replied simply. Daniel finally stepped forward slightly, his voice low. I will cooperate fully with the audit process, he said, and Jonathan acknowledged the statement with a brief nod, neither dismissing nor extending it further. The boardroom remained still for a moment longer, the earlier tension now replaced by a structured calm that followed confirmed. Resolution. Jonathan gathered the remaining documents into a single stack, then looked toward the executive team. We will reconvene once verification is complete, he said, signaling the formal closure of the meeting phase. Chairs shifted quietly as executives began to stand, gathering their materials without conversation, the energy of urgency replaced with procedural discipline. Aaliyah finally turned slightly toward Jonathan as he stepped away from the table, and for the first time he spoke to her, without referencing the situation itself. Thank you for your attention to detail, he said simply. Aaliyah gave a small nod, then stepped back slightly as the room began to clear. Victoria exited with composed steps. Daniel followed shortly after, and the remaining executives left in quiet sequence until only Jonathan and Aaliyah were briefly left in the boardroom, the city skyline visible through the glass behind them, reflecting a calm that had been restored not by assumption, but by verified truth. The boardroom had finally emptied, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps fading behind the glass doors and the quiet hum of the city beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, where Manhattan stretched out under late afternoon light like a living grid of steel and glass. Jonathan Pierce stood near the table for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the polished surface where the envelopes had just been removed for audit. His expression no longer focused on urgency, but on reflection. Aaliyah Carter remained a few feet away, near the edge of the room where the carpet met the marble floor, her small frame still and calm, as if she was simply waiting for the next natural moment rather than expecting anything from it. Jonathan slowly turned toward her, his voice softer now, stripped of the formality that had defined the meeting. You did not hesitate when you spoke, he said, more like an observation than a question, and Aaliyah looked up briefly but did not answer immediately. There was a pause between them, not uncomfortable, but measured, as if both understood that what had just happened was already settling into place and no longer needed to be repeated. Jonathan continued, most people in that room are trained to observe details. Very few are trained to trust what they see when it contradicts procedure, he said, and Aaliyah lowered her gaze slightly, listening without reaction. He stepped closer to the window, looking out at the city below where traffic moved steadily through avenues measured in straight lines and predictable motion, then added, You saw something others ignored. Aaliyah finally spoke in a quiet voice. It did not look right, she said simply, as if that alone explained everything. Jonathan nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer more fully than any formal report he had reviewed that day. A soft knock came from the door, and a staff assistant entered briefly, placing a secure tablet on the side table before exiting without speaking, leaving the room even quieter than before. Jonathan glanced at the device, then back at Aaliyah. Your statement has been added to the official audit record, he said, then paused, as if considering something beyond procedure, and it will remain part of the final compliance report. Aaliyah did not respond immediately, her attention shifting briefly to the skyline, where sunlight reflected off distant buildings in thin horizontal lines. Jonathan folded his hands behind his back, still standing near the window, and spoke again. You understand that what you noticed could have altered a transaction involving hundreds of millions of United States dollars, he said, and Aaliyah turned her head slightly back toward him but remained silent. There was no pride in her expression, only quiet understanding, as if the scale of the number did not change the simplicity of what she had observed. Jonathan continued after a moment. Most adults in that room rely on assumptions supported by hierarchy. You relied on observation unsupported by permission, he said, and the distinction hung in the air between them. Aaliyah shifted her small backpack strap slightly on her shoulder, then asked softly, "Will everything be okay now?" And Jonathan looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said finally, because it was caught before it became final. The words were simple, but they carried weight that seemed to settle the entire room, even in its emptiness. Another pause followed, during which the city outside continued its constant motion, indifferent to the events that had just taken place above it. Jonathan walked slowly back toward the table, gathering the remaining administrative folders that had not been removed, organizing them with deliberate precision as if restoring order extended beyond documents. Aaliyah remained where she was, watching quietly as he worked, her presence neither intrusive nor demanding, simply existing within the space that had briefly transformed because of her observation. After a moment, Jonathan spoke again without looking up. "You were correct about the envelope," he said, then added after a brief pause. "And that level of certainty should not be ignored in environments like this." Aaliyah gave a small nod, acknowledging the statement without needing to expand on it. Jonathan finally closed the last folder and turned toward her again, his tone shifting slightly, less corporate, more direct. "Do you attend school in this city?" he asked, and Aaliyah nodded. He considered this for a moment, then said, "You should continue developing that ability to notice what others overlook." And Aaliyah looked down slightly, as if unsure how to receive that instruction. A soft chime sounded from Jonathan's watch, signaling a scheduled transition to his next appointment, and he glanced at it briefly before returning his attention to her one last time. "Thank you for staying until the matter was resolved," he said, and Aaliyah simply nodded again. Jonathan moved toward the door, pausing briefly as it opened automatically, and then stepped out into the corridor, leaving Aaliyah alone for a moment in the quiet boardroom with the view of the city still glowing beyond the glass, where everything that had just happened now existed only as confirmed record and silent memory. The boardroom door closed softly behind Jonathan Pierce, leaving Aaliyah Carter alone in the vast silence of the glass-walled room, where the city skyline continued to glow beyond the windows, as if nothing inside the building had changed at all, even though everything had already shifted. For a few seconds, she simply stood still, her small reflection faintly visible against the polished table where the envelopes had once been placed, now removed and sent for audit, leaving only empty space behind. Outside the room, footsteps and distant elevator chimes echoed through the executive floor, signaling that the formal structure of the meeting had fully dissolved into normal corporate movement again. Yet inside the boardroom, time felt slower, quieter, almost suspended. A moment later, the door opened again and a female executive assistant entered cautiously, holding a light tablet and a visitor badge, her expression softening slightly when she saw Aaliyah still standing there alone. "Mr. Pierce asked that you be escorted to the lobby," she said gently, stepping closer without urgency, as if careful not to overwhelm the child with the weight of the building around her. Aaliyah nodded quietly, adjusting the strap of her small backpack, and followed the assistant out into the corridor where the lighting shifted from warm conference tones to cooler corporate white, reflecting off glass and steel surfaces that stretched in long lines down the hallway. As they walked, several employees passing by slowed briefly, noticing the unusual presence of a child moving through an environment designed entirely for adult negotiations, but no one stopped them. In a nearby conference room, Daniel Brooks sat alone, reviewing logs on a tablet with tense focus, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet urgency as he attempted to reconstruct procedural timelines. While in another office down the hall, Victoria Hale stood near a window, phone in hand, speaking in a controlled voice to an external contact. Her tone measured but clearly recalibrating priorities after the unexpected disruption. Meanwhile, in a descending elevator, Jonathan Pierce remained silent, his reflection visible in the polished steel doors as the floors changed one by one, his mind no longer on the acquisition itself, but on the sequence of events that had unfolded with a clarity he had not anticipated. He replayed the moment Aaliyah spoke, not as emotion, but as observation, and the precision of her certainty remained with him longer than any data point from the audit screen. As the elevator reached the lobby level, he paused before stepping out, then changed direction without explanation, pressing a button to return upward, his decision immediate and unannounced. Back on the executive floor, Aaliyah reached the lobby entrance with the assistant, where the atmosphere shifted again into a more public corporate space filled with reception desks, polished seating areas, and quiet movement of professionals moving in and out of scheduled meetings. The assistant knelt slightly to her level. "Mr. Pierce asked me to make sure you are safely arranged for transportation," she said, and Aaliyah nodded again, looking briefly toward the revolving glass doors where city light streamed in. Before anything else could be arranged, the elevator behind them chimed open and Jonathan Pierce stepped out, his presence immediately noticed by nearby staff who straightened instinctively as he moved forward. He walked directly toward Aaliyah and the assistant, stopping at a comfortable distance, his expression no longer formal but attentive in a quieter way. "I need to adjust something," he said simply to the assistant, who nodded and stepped aside without question. Jonathan looked at Aaliyah for a moment, then spoke in a calm voice. "You were not part of the meeting, but your input changed its outcome," he said, and Aaliyah listened without interruption, her posture still small but steady. He continued, "Most systems in this building are designed around assumptions supported by hierarchy, but what you demonstrated was direct observation without permission bias," he said, then paused briefly as if considering how to translate that into something appropriate beyond corporate language. After a moment he added, "That is not common." Aaliyah looked down slightly, as if unsure how to respond to the acknowledgement, and simply said, "I just saw it," in a quiet tone. Jonathan nodded once, then turned slightly toward the assistant. "Prepare a formal educational sponsorship file under my private foundation," he said, and the assistant immediately began typing on her tablet without hesitation. Aaliyah looked up briefly, noticing the shift in tone but not fully understanding the scale of what had just been initiated. Jonathan then added, "No obligations beyond school enrollment and support. Keep it independent of corporate records, ensuring the instruction remained precise and separate from business operations." The assistant confirmed quietly and stepped away to execute the request. For a brief moment, the lobby felt still again, as people around them continued their movement without interruption, unaware of the quiet structural change being initiated in parallel to the corporate world above. Jonathan looked back at Aaliyah, then said, "You should continue developing how you see things, but make sure you are always protected while doing so," his voice calm but direct. Aaliyah nodded again, her eyes briefly shifting toward the large glass entrance doors where daylight reflected across the floor in wide pale streaks. Jonathan stepped slightly aside, allowing her space to move toward the exit if she chose, but did not leave immediately. As Aaliyah walked forward with the assistant toward the building exit, Jonathan remained behind for a moment, watching the flow of people and systems around him, then turned slowly back toward the elevators, his expression thoughtful, as if the events of the day had not concluded but only redirected into a different path that would continue beyond the walls of the building. The revolving glass doors of the corporate tower closed behind Aaliyah Carter as she stepped out into the Manhattan afternoon, where the city noise immediately expanded around her like a living wave, taxis passing, distant horns sounding, and pedestrians moving in constant motion along the wide sidewalks. The assistant walked beside her for a few steps, making sure she was oriented toward the designated pickup point, but Aaliyah's attention drifted slightly upward toward the tall building she had just exited, its reflective glass surface now blending into the skyline, as if nothing unusual had occurred inside. A few minutes later, a black vehicle with tinted windows pulled up quietly to the curb, and the assistant confirmed the vehicle details before gently guiding Aaliyah toward the rear door. "Your transportation is confirmed," she said softly, ensuring the child felt no urgency or pressure, and Aaliyah gave a small nod before stepping into the vehicle. As the door closed, the interior remained quiet, the city still visible through the tinted glass, but softened by reflection and distance. Meanwhile, several floors above, Jonathan Pierce stood alone in his office, reviewing the final audit summary that had been transmitted to his private terminal. The confirmed discrepancy, now clearly documented with timestamps, access logs, and chain of custody records. He read through it once without expression, then a second time more slowly, his focus not on error itself, but on the structure that had allowed it to occur unnoticed until the moment Aaliyah intervened. His assistant entered briefly to place a sealed confirmation file on his desk. "The external audit team has acknowledged receipt and will begin verification protocol immediately," she said, and Jonathan nodded without looking away from the screen. "Ensure full transparency across all internal compliance divisions," he replied, his tone steady and final. As the assistant left, Jonathan leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze shifting toward the window where the city stretched far into the distance under a fading afternoon light. For a long moment he did not move, as if revisiting the sequence of events not as disruption, but as recalibration. Down on the street, Aaliyah's vehicle merged into traffic, moving slowly through avenues lined with glass towers and construction cranes, the city continuing its rhythm unchanged. Inside the car, she sat quietly, her small hands resting in her lap, her backpack beside her, watching buildings pass by without urgency or excitement, only quiet observation. The driver maintained a steady route, following the designated path toward a residential area listed in the transportation instructions provided by the corporate assistant. As the vehicle turned onto a wider avenue, Aaliyah's gaze briefly caught reflections of sunlight on glass facades, shifting patterns of light that moved like slow waves across the surfaces of the city. Back at the tower, Daniel Brooks remained in a separate compliance room, carefully documenting procedural notes, his earlier confidence replaced with meticulous attention as he reconstructed the sequence of document handling step by step. Victoria Hale, now seated in a private office, reviewed internal communications on a secure device, her expression controlled but focused, preparing formal responses to anticipated partner inquiries regarding the temporary suspension of the transaction. Neither of them spoke to the other, each working independently within the same building, now separated by interpretation of the same event. Jonathan finally stood from his desk and walked toward the window again, placing one hand lightly against the glass as he looked out over the city. The reflection of the skyline merged with his image, creating a layered silhouette against the bright horizon. His expression remained thoughtful, not disturbed, but recalibrated, as if the day's events had introduced a variable that could not be removed from consideration. He turned slightly, returning to his desk, and opened a new internal file labeled with restricted access clearance, entering notes that would later be integrated into a broader review of operational protocol integrity. At the same time, Aaliyah's vehicle approached a quieter residential block where tree-lined sidewalks replaced dense towers, and the pace of movement outside the window became slower, more spaced, more residential. The car came to a gentle stop near a secure building entrance, and the driver confirmed arrival through a scheduled system notification. Aaliyah stepped out carefully, looking up at the building, then back toward the street where the city continued its endless motion beyond her immediate surroundings. The assistant's earlier words about educational support remained unspoken in her mind, not fully understood in scale, but present as a quiet shift in possibility. Inside the tower, Jonathan Pierce closed the file on his screen and sat back once more, the room quiet except for the distant sound of wind against glass, as the events of the day settled into structured record, becoming part of a larger system that would continue adjusting long after the moment of discovery had passed. The evening settled over Manhattan with a quiet heaviness as the city lights began to rise one by one, reflecting across glass towers and long stretches of avenue traffic. While inside a high-floor office, Jonathan Pierce remained seated alone, reviewing the final consolidated audit report that had been delivered to his secure terminal. The document confirmed every procedural inconsistency that had been flagged earlier in the day, with complete timestamp alignment, verified chain of custody records, and a full internal acknowledgement of unauthorized envelope substitution within the compliance handling process. Jonathan read the final summary slowly, not because the information was unclear, but because the implications extended beyond the transaction itself and into the structural reliability of systems he had trusted for years. A notification appeared on his screen indicating that external auditors had formally accepted the case for independent verification and that all related financial activity had been temporarily suspended pending full procedural validation. He closed the document without urgency, leaning back in his chair as the weight of resolution replaced the tension of uncertainty that had defined the earlier hours. Across the city, Aaliyah Carter stood inside the entrance lobby of a quiet residential building, the lighting warmer and softer than the corporate tower she had left behind, as a building coordinator confirmed her assigned residence details through a secure system tablet. Her small backpack rested on her shoulder, and she looked around briefly at the calm environment, where the sounds of the city were now distant rather than surrounding. The coordinator knelt slightly to her level, speaking gently. "Your placement and educational support arrangements have been confirmed under private foundation sponsorship," she said. Though the language was formal, her tone was careful and reassuring. Aaliyah nodded slightly, not fully understanding the scale of what had been arranged, but recognizing that something around her had changed in a way that would extend beyond a single day. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks sat alone in a compliance review office within the corporate tower, documenting each step of the document handling sequence with precise timestamps. His earlier confidence replaced with methodical focus as he reconstructed the procedural chain from the initial intake to the final exchange. His report now reflected full cooperation with internal audit standards, and his communications were redirected to legal oversight for continued evaluation. In a separate office, Victoria Hale reviewed formal correspondence drafts prepared for external stakeholders, carefully adjusting language to maintain corporate stability while acknowledging procedural review without exposing unnecessary detail. Her expression remained composed, but the tone of her communications had shifted toward caution and restraint, reflecting the changed outcome of the day's events. Back in Jonathan Pierce's office, the city skyline stretched across the glass wall behind him, illuminated by thousands of small lights that moved in continuous rhythm. He stood and walked slowly toward the window, placing one hand lightly against the glass as he looked out, not at a single point, but at the broader structure of the city itself, as if considering systems rather than outcomes. A notification arrived indicating that a formal educational sponsorship file had been initiated under his private foundation, including enrollment support, transportation coordination, and long-term academic monitoring eligibility, all structured independently from corporate operations. Jonathan reviewed the confirmation briefly, then closed the notification without reaction, allowing it to integrate into the background of his ongoing responsibilities. At the residential building, Aaliyah had been guided to a quiet interior space where she would remain under supervised accommodation, with access to educational placement services scheduled for the following day. She sat near a window, looking outside at the soft movement of streetlights and passing vehicles, her reflection faint against the glass as she remained still, observing rather than reacting. The coordinator informed her that transportation to school orientation would be arranged in the morning, then quietly left the room to allow her space. In the corporate tower, Jonathan returned to his desk and opened a new internal note file labeled under Strategic Review Protocols, entering brief observations regarding procedural vulnerability detection, independent verification triggers, and non-hierarchical observation impact within high-value decision environments. He paused for a moment after typing, then added a final line regarding system improvement potential through unexpected external insight sources, before closing the file. The office remained quiet except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the faint movement of the city outside. Hours later, as night deepened across Manhattan, Jonathan left his office and stepped into the corridor, where the building had already transitioned into reduced activity mode. He paused briefly near the elevator, then pressed the descent button, his reflection appearing faintly in the polished metal doors as they opened. At the same time, Aaliyah lay resting in her assigned room, the quiet hum of the building surrounding her like a steady background presence, her small backpack placed carefully near the bed, the day's events settling into memory rather than urgency. Jonathan exited the tower into the night air, where the streets were calmer but still alive with motion, and looked once more toward the upper floors of the building before turning away and walking into the city. The events of the day did not conclude with celebration or disruption, but with structured continuation, where systems adjusted, decisions stabilized, and a single observation from an unexpected voice had already been absorbed into a larger framework that would continue to evolve beyond the moment it began.